Sit down, Alia. This won't take long. Grant Knox's voice snapped across the executive boardroom like a whip. A file folder slid across the polished table with a sharp slap. You don't own a thing here, he said with a smirk, each word trying to strip me of more than my title. The sentence hung in the air. My ears burned as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me, some wide with shock, others carefully blank. No one spoke. A woman I had once mentored, whose career I had defended more times than I could count, lowered her gaze to her notepad. She couldn't meet my eyes. That silence was louder than any insult. In moments like this, when the world tries to erase your worth, remember to breathe. Open a window. Take care of yourself. This matters. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever felt invisible where you gave everything, hit like and subscribe. My name is Alia Dean. For 11 years, I was Director of Risk Underwriting at Strategium Dynamics. I built the safety nets no one noticed when reckless deals threatened to sink us. I combed through pages of legalese, flagged hidden traps, and made sure contracts could withstand lawsuits, audits, or political storms. I wasn't glamorous, but I was why Strategem never collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. I missed holidays, family dinners, even my father's last birthday, everything, because I was guarding the company from itself. Across from me stood Grant Knox, CEO, in a custom navy suit, hair slicked back, the very picture of corporate power to investors. To outsiders, he was a visionary. To us, he was a gambler who craved applause more than stability. He hated pauses. I had always been the one pressing the brakes hardest. Now, with cameras waiting in the lobby and a $1.9 billion deal within his reach, he wanted me gone, stripped, humiliated, forgotten. The room felt colder than steel, I should have argued. I should have shouted or begged. Instead, I reached for the envelope. My hands were steady despite the fire in my chest. A thin smile touched my lips, private and unreadable. I tucked the envelope under my arm, stood, and walked to the door without a word. Their confusion was almost tangible. They expected a breakdown, a storm. I gave them silence. I knew silence could be the most dangerous answer of all. The click of the door closed behind me, the weight of sacrifice. The echo of the boardroom door closing still reverberated in my chest as I stepped into the corridor. For a moment, the fluorescent lights above seemed harsher than ever, pressing down on me as if to remind me of every hour I had sacrificed here. 11 years of my life poured into Strategem Dynamics, and this was the reward. An envelope, a smirk, and the hollow declaration that I owned nothing. My phone buzzed in my hand. The caller ID made my throat tighten. Mom. I hesitated, then answered anyway. Her voice, tremulous yet firm, spilled through the line. Alia, you gave them your youth, your late nights, your health. You missed holidays, anniversaries, even your father's last birthday. And for what? For them to do this to you? I leaned against the cold wall, eyes shutting against the memory of empty chairs at family dinners, of my desk lamp burning past midnight. The birthdays marked only by emails and cold coffee. Her words weren't accusations. They were grief laced with love. But the truth in them cut deeper than anything Grant Knox had thrown at me. I wanted to tell her it had been worth it, that protecting the company had somehow protected us too. But the words wouldn't come. All I could whisper was, I know. Another buzz cut through the silence. This time a message. Anya Patel, my closest confidant at Strategem. The one who used to slip me coffee during weekend marathons. The woman whose promotion I had fought for against Grant's dismissive glare. Her text was short, almost clinical. I'm sorry, Alia. I can't speak up. I need this job, my mortgage, my kids. I can't risk it. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Bitterness settled in my chest, heavier than the envelope I still carried. Betrayal doesn't always come as a knife in the back. Sometimes it arrives as silence, the absence of the voice you thought would rise when yours was taken. And yet, even in that hollow ache, a truth surfaced. One that brought both irony and grim satisfaction. Strategem still stood, not because of Grant's reckless bravado or the fear of those too timid to speak, but because of me. The compliance framework I had built, The architecture I had designed was still woven into every billion-dollar deal. Every client assurance, every legal safeguard keeping stratagem from collapse bore my fingerprints. They could strip my title, erase my name from the door, pretend I had never existed. But the invisible spine of the company remained mine. Despite what Grant Knox declared, the business still breathed through the work they tried to cast aside. I straightened, pocketed my phone, and took a slow breath. The bitterness didn't fade, but it sharpened into something else. A quiet reminder that endings aren't always collapses. Sometimes they're openings no one else can see. 2 nights later, I sat in my apartment. The television, the antagonist's glory. The television flickered against the dim walls. I hadn't planned on watching, but curiosity has a way of pulling you back toward the very wounds you're trying to forget. There he was, Grant Knox, in his custom Navy suit, seated comfortably before a panel of reporters. His smile was easy, practiced, almost smug. "We are on the brink of history," he declared, his voice like a salesman sealing a deal. Stratagem Dynamics is prepared to deliver on the most ambitious $1.9 billion contract of the decade. And let me be clear, what slowed us down in the past is no longer an obstacle. Some people, he continued, had been nothing but dead weight, a brake pedal on progress. He leaned forward, eyes glittering with theatrical disdain. That so-called caution? Just a stone in the road. And stones don't run companies. I didn't need to guess who he meant. My stomach tightened, but my hands stayed folded in my lap. There it was, my career, my loyalty, reduced to a punchline on live television. The camera panned briefly to the board seated behind him. Even through the screen, I saw the fracture lines. A few of the older directors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes betraying unease. They had been in those closed-door meetings with me. They had seen the warnings I flagged in red ink. They knew I wasn't dead weight. I was the one holding back disaster, but none of them spoke. Not one. The newer investors, however, applauded Grant's bravado. They didn't want caution. They wanted speed, risk, spectacle. They believed in his gamble because they were dazzled by the shine of his confidence, blinded by their hunger for returns. They chose to ignore the cracks beneath the surface. I felt the anger coil inside me, hot and slow. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that simmers until it consumes everything. He could rewrite the narrative in front of cameras, but he couldn't erase the truth. Then came the moment that nearly made me laugh out loud. Grant lifted a sheath of papers with a flourish, as though revealing some sacred text. "We have what I call a contingency ownership framework," he announced, savoring the syllables like a magician unveiling his trick. My jaw clenched. That phrase was mine. I had coined it years ago in the very documents he signed without even bothering to read. To him, it was just jargon, a shiny phrase to impress investors. But to me, it was the backbone of every safeguard I had built, the framework that gave me more leverage than he could ever imagine. He wielded my words like a weapon, blind to the fact they were double-edged. And as the applause echoed through the screen, I realized something vital. He had just handed me the rope with which his empire could be undone. The anger inside me didn't fade. It sharpened. The buried claws. The sound of Grant Knox boasting on television still echoed in my head long after the broadcast ended. His grin, his careless misuse of words he didn't even understand. It lingered like smoke in a room I couldn't clear. But beneath the sting of humiliation, something else began to stir. A memory, faint at first, then sharp enough to cut through the haze. I pulled an old leather briefcase from the back of my closet, the one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were neatly organized binders, color-coded tabs, and files stamped with the heavy ink of the legal department that had once mocked me for being too cautious. My fingers brushed a folder marked 2018 European Consortium Draft. That year had been a battlefield. Grant had been desperate to close a string of international defense contracts, pushing deals faster than the lawyers could review them. He waved me off when I tried to explain the need for safeguards. "Do whatever you want, Aaliyah," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. Just keep the clients happy and off my back, so I did. And in doing so, I created something he never bothered to understand. Vantage Point LLC, an anonymous holding entity designed to shield Stratagem from liability during the earliest phases of billion-dollar contracts. On paper, it looked like another shell company. In reality, I had registered myself as the sole authorized signatory. It wasn't ego. It was necessity. If anything went wrong, the company needed a single responsible figure to hold the line. I remembered the laughter from the in-house legal team when I presented the framework. Overkill, one had chuckled. Aaliyah, you act like we're preparing for war. Their mockery stung, but I didn't care. I'd learned the hard way that the biggest collapses begin with the smallest oversights. Now, flipping through those pages, my eyes locked on the line that mattered. Authorized signatory. Aaliyah Dean. The ink was mine. The authority was mine. Nothing Grant or anyone else had signed since could erase that. My heart pounded, not with anger this time, but with something steadier. Hope, quiet and restrained, but real. The very framework they'd dismissed as paranoia had become my shield. Grant could parade his ignorance in front of cameras all he wanted, but the truth lay here in black and white. The $1.9 billion contract with the European consortium wasn't Stratagem's. It belonged to Vantage Point LLC. Vantage Point was mine. I leaned back and stared at the neat signature. I had scrawled 7 years earlier. They'd mocked me for being too cautious, but in their laughter I had found leverage. The silence of my apartment no longer felt empty. It felt like a harbor, holding something they could never see coming. For the first time since that humiliating boardroom, I allowed myself a small, private smile. What happens when someone who's been underestimated for years finally holds all the cards? Will I reveal my hand quietly, or will Grant strike first in desperation? Stay with me. What comes next will surprise you. Morning light filtered through the blinds, falling across the open binder that had once been dismissed as paranoia, and now felt suddenly like the key to everything. The silent preparation, the signature, my signature, stared back at me like a quiet anchor. For days I'd carried humiliation like a stone in my chest. Now something steadier took root, resolve. Not hot or reckless, just clear and deliberate. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a deep, measured voice answered. "This is Dr. Helmut Cray." "Dr. Cray," I said, forcing my voice even. "This is Aaliyah Dean. We met during the 2018 negotiations. I was director of risk underwriting at Stratagem Dynamics." A pause, then a shift in his tone. Yes." The cautious one. "What can I do for you, Ms. Dean?" I walked him through it, page by page. Vantage Point LLC, my role as sole authorized signatory, and the fact that the $1.9 billion agreement he believed finalized under Stratagem was actually incomplete without my signature. There was silence long enough that I wondered if I'd overplayed my hand. Then he spoke, slow and deliberate. "If what you're saying is accurate, Stratagem has no authority to move that contract forward. Without your signature, it's invalid." Relief came like air finally finding my lungs. It wasn't triumph, just confirmation. The framework I'd built and they'd mocked was now the fulcrum. But reality pushed back. Stratagem wouldn't fold quietly. I'd heard whisperings from former colleagues. Gideon Hale, the company's sharp-tongued general counsel, was drafting a replacement agreement, a counterfeit meant to cut me out before anyone outside noticed the gap. Gideon was clever, ruthless, and fiercely loyal to Grant Knox. If he succeeded, I'd lose everything before I could be heard. "Dr. Cray," I said carefully, "I need you to see the original documents yourself. Stratagem will try to convince you otherwise." "I expected as much," he replied. His voice softened, not with pity, but with a kind of respect. "We're holding a press conference to announce the contract next week. Why don't you attend? Not as an employee. You aren't one anymore. But as an independent observer." The word landed like a challenge. Guest, not a seat at the table, but an invitation into the room where the facade would crack. "Thank you, Dr. Cray," I said. My voice stayed steady, though my pulse quickened after the call ended. I sat in the quiet while the city hummed outside my window. The bitterness remained, but it no longer ruled me. Every move from now on would be measured and deliberate. The next time I stepped into their world, it wouldn't be as the woman they'd cast aside. It would be on my terms. The boardroom showdown. The conference hall gleamed under the blaze of stage lights, rows of cameras lined up like soldiers, their lenses fixed on the podium. The air itself felt rehearsed, heavy with anticipation and the hum of whispered speculation. I sat quietly in the back row, an anonymous face among reporters, investors, and curious onlookers. No one paid me any attention, and that anonymity was its own strange comfort. Then the doors opened, and in walked Grant Knox. His navy suit was immaculate, his smile broad and rehearsed. The applause swelled, engineered yet convincing. He raised a hand, savoring the moment as though this were not a press conference but a coronation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming through the hall. "Today marks a historic achievement. Stratagem Dynamics has successfully secured the $1.9 billion contract with the European Consortium. This deal will propel us into a new era of growth, innovation, and global leadership." Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. For a moment, the illusion seemed complete. Grant basked in it, nodding to the board members seated behind him. Some smiled, though their eyes betrayed nerves. They had seen the fine print. They knew the risks. A silver-haired shareholder rose slowly from his seat. "Mr. Knox," he said carefully, "there have been whispers about missing authorizations in the paperwork, specifically a required signature. Can you address that?" The room shifted. The low hum of side conversations grew louder. Grant chuckled, dismissive. "Minor technicalities. Bureaucratic dust, nothing more. Rest assured, Stratagem controls every inch of this contract." His tone carried a dare, a challenge to anyone who might press further, but unease lingered like a low tremor beneath the applause. The shareholder sat down slowly, lips pressed tight. That was when Dr. Helmut Cray rose from his seat at the consortium's table. Calm, deliberate, he adjusted his glasses before speaking into the microphone. "I regret to inform you," he said, his voice steady, "that what Mr. Knox has stated is not entirely accurate. Without the authorization of Vantage Point LLC, this contract is not valid." The words struck like thunder. A silence fell so heavy it pressed against the walls. Grant's smile faltered, just slightly but enough for those watching closely to see. Cameras swung toward Cray. Reporters leaned forward like predators scenting blood. "What nonsense is this?" Grant barked, though his laugh sounded brittle. "Vantage Point is a technical placeholder, nothing more." Cray shook his head, firm and unflinching. "It is not a placeholder. It is the legal holding entity. Only its authorized signatory can finalize the agreement. Until that happens, Stratagem has no enforceable contract." The air tightened. My heart pounded, but my face remained still, hidden in the shadows. I watched the empire begin to crack, each word from Cray carving deeper into the illusion Grant had built. The tension in the hall was no longer anticipation. It was the sharp edge of revelation. And though no one looked my way yet, I knew the silence would not last. The silence after Dr. Cray's announcement was thick, waiting to break. The false hope. The weight of the moment shifted, thick and electric, like a storm about to break. The hall, moments before a theater of applause, now felt like a courtroom. Cameras zoomed in, microphones craned closer. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath as every eye turned toward me. Grant Knox's smile, the one that had seemed unshakable, stiffened. Gideon Hale's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the edge of his folder. The seals and stamps that had moments ago projected unshakable authority now looked flimsy under the stark contrast of the document I had placed on the table. "This," I said, my voice steady but rising with every word, "is the original framework, filed, registered, and verified. Without this authorization, Stratagem Dynamics does not and cannot hold the $1.9 billion contract you're touting here today." The reporters, who only seconds ago had been circling like vultures around a disgruntled ex-employee narrative, pivoted. Pens scratched furiously. Lenses clicked. Questions fired from every direction, directed not at me now, but at Grant and Gideon. Mr. Knox, did Stratagem know about this prior to the announcement? Mr. Hale, is it true this contract is unenforceable without Ms. Dean's signature? Dr. Cray, can you confirm the validity of her claim? I saw Dr. Cray stand, calm and measured as ever, but this time his presence radiated gravity. I can confirm, he said into the microphone, that Ms. Dean's documents are authentic. Without her signature, the contract between the European Consortium and Stratagem Dynamics is not legally binding. The silence that followed was no longer the hush of anticipation. It was the stunned quiet of a narrative collapsing in real time. Grant opened his mouth as though to speak, but nothing came. His jaw flexed. The cameras caught it, every twitch, every crack in his composure. Gideon shuffled his papers, but his eyes flicked downward, avoiding mine. I stood there, binder still open, my fingers resting on the signature they had dismissed for years. The humiliation that had weighed me down in the boardroom had burned off, leaving something sharper, cleaner. Power didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was a single signature, sitting quietly for years, waiting for the moment when silence could become a weapon. I closed the binder with a soft, deliberate snap that echoed louder than any gavel. Now, I said evenly, shall we continue this conversation with the truth? The cameras roared. Reporters surged forward. The illusion Grant Knox had built was cracking before a live audience, and for the first time, he knew it, the revelation. The document in my hands felt heavier than any briefcase I'd carried into Stratagem's offices. I laid it flat on the table so the cameras could catch the seal, glinting under the lights, the unmistakable mark of the Department of Defense. My voice didn't waver. This, I said, is the binding agreement. The $1.9 billion contract is not controlled by Stratagem Dynamics. It belongs to Vantage Point LLC, and I am its sole signatory. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief so much as shock, the kind that drowns out applause and protest alike. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised and frozen. Dr. Helmut Cray stepped up beside me, adjusted his glasses, and said, I have reviewed these documents personally. She is correct. Without Ms. Dean's authorization, this contract is null. Stratagem has no legal claim. The words landed like a verdict. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Investors murmured in alarm. Board members exchanged frantic looks. Somewhere near the back, a shareholder's pen clattered to the floor. Grant Knox surged to his feet, face flushing crimson. This is betrayal, he thundered, voice cracking. You think you can walk back in and steal what I built? You were a glorified paper pusher, Aaliyah, nothing more. His rage should have frightened me, but it only underscored the truth. He wasn't in control anymore. An older director who'd served nearly 2 decades leaned forward. Mr. Knox, she said carefully, these papers bear your initials. Vantage Point was approved by you in 2018. Another director rifled through his folder and produced a scanned memo. Yes, he added, disbelief in his voice. You signed this into policy. I remember the meeting. You dismissed it as a formality. Grant froze as recognition replaced fury. He had approved the very safeguard that now disarmed him. His signature, scrawled years ago, stared back like a ghost come to collect a debt. Cameras caught every tremor, the twitch of a jaw, the sweat at his temple, as the board's confidence cracked with each revealed page. Reporters whispered, already composing headlines, CEO undone by his own signature. I stood motionless, not triumphant, not gloating, just present. For years I'd been the quiet voice no one wanted to hear. Now the truth I had carried alone rang louder than any speech Grant had ever given. The hall buzzed with disbelief, and beneath it a new current surged. The reversal was no longer hypothetical. It was happening here and now in plain sight. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, the company announced an emergency board meeting. Legal teams were mobilized, and journalists camped outside. Stratagem's headquarters, waiting for answers that Grant Knox could no longer buy with a smile. The collapse begins morning headlines blazed across every major financial outlet. Stratagem's $1.9 billion deal in jeopardy. Stock tickers bled red as the company's value plummeted. Millions erased in minutes. Investors who had once praised Grant Knox as a visionary now scrambled to distance themselves, their phone calls clipped and icy. I watched the chaos unfold on television. Cameras captured Grant storming out of headquarters while shareholders demanded answers. His once loyal allies peeled away, their silence now as damning as their applause had been. The empire he built on charm and bravado was crumbling in real time, every brick loosened by the truth he had ignored. In the middle of the collapse, my phone buzzed. "Aaliyah, we need to talk. Please." It was from Gideon Hale. Hours later, he found me in a quiet cafe, stripped of his courtroom swagger. His voice cracked as he leaned across the table. "We can fix this. If you let Stratagem retain partial rights, I'll make sure you get 50% of the profits. 50. That's more than fair." I held his gaze, the bitterness of years of dismissal still sharp in my chest. "You think I want scraps?" I asked softly. "You think this was ever about money?" He flinched at the calm in my tone, because calm was something he couldn't bargain against. I stood, leaving him with nothing but the sound of his own desperation. That afternoon, Dr. Helmut Cray called. His voice carried the same steady weight it had during the negotiations years ago. "Ms. Dean," he said, "the consortium has no desire to waste time. Stratagem is compromised. But if you're willing, we would welcome Vantage Point LLC as the lead contractor in their place." For a moment, I let the words sink in. All the humiliation, the silence, the betrayal, it had led to this. Stratagem's loss was now my gain. Not through revenge shouted in anger, but through patience, truth, and the framework I built when no one was watching. And just like that, the company that once told me I owned, nothing was about to watch me sign everything in my own name. The signing ceremony was nothing like the boardrooms I had once known. The liberation had once endured rooms like this. Heavy oak tables, forced applause, smug smirks from men who thought they owned the air I breathed. But not today. This room was quiet, deliberate, and honest. Dr. Helmut Cray slid the final document across the table toward me. The pages crisp and unmarked, untouched by Stratagem's hands. "Ms. Dean," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "With your signature, Vantage Point LLC becomes the lead contractor. The consortium is ready to proceed under your authority." My pen hovered for a heartbeat, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. 11 years of sacrifice, humiliation, and silence had brought me here. I pressed ink to paper, each stroke of my name carving away the weight of everything they once claimed I didn't own. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Stratagem loses $1.9 billion deal. CEO Grant Knox under investigation. The empire he had built on arrogance and recklessness was unraveling under scrutiny. His name, once synonymous with power, now bound to failure. I sat by my window, phone buzzing endlessly with notifications. Reporters wanted statements. Investors wanted introductions. Old colleagues wanted to reconnect. I ignored most of them, but one message made me pause. It was from my mother. "You finally claimed what you deserve. Your father would be proud." Tears pricked at my eyes as I read her words. I thought of the birthdays I missed, the empty chairs at family dinners, the moments I'd traded away in the name of duty. For years, I wondered if it had all been for nothing. Now, at last, the scales felt balanced. Later that afternoon, I walked into the consortium's headquarters. The polished brass plaque gleamed in the light of the atrium. Vantage Point LLC, lead contractor. I stopped, my reflection flickering across the letters for the first time in over a decade. I smiled without restraint. They thought I owned nothing, I whispered to myself. But my silence was my greatest asset. My name, once dismissed, now stood where the world could see it. Never mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes it's the quiet work, the overlooked effort, that changes everything when the moment arrives. Tell me in the comments. If you were in Aaliyah's place, would you have stayed silent or fought back sooner? Tap like, share this story with someone who needs encouragement, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice.